question about theory then, if that's what theory does, why do that? Why do it? I mean, it's incredibly inefficient. That's one real, so for instance, and we'll talk about this in terms of various resistances to theory, but like, I handed out the syllabus, and you all did your work, and we never had to talk about it. And then I had to go and blow it and bring it up again. And now we're like thinking about the syllabus, and it's taking a lot of time. Like, isn't it inefficient?
Well, fascism's really efficient. There's no theorizing in that.
Okay, good. So we can begin to problematize the notion of efficiency, whether or not that's a necessarily valuable capitalist product, yes. But why do it? What happens, what becomes available, or what becomes possible via theorizing that isn't possible before?
Well, you're ferreting out like underlying structures that you don't really think about.
What happens when you do that?
You've got the power.
How so?
You can restructure what it is that you're doing and find a better way to do it.
Right, you can, I mean, I would say the simplest way for me to say it is that via theorizing, those concepts become questionable. By which I don't mean suspicious or bad, I mean able to be questioned. Right? So it's precisely the questioning of why are we reading Martin Luther King, why not read People magazine, that has enabled people to be like, well, let's try that. Right? In other words, rendering the concepts visible that structure the particular practice enables you to question those concepts. Now let me be very clear about this, and I think this is a key distinction. I'm going to talk about these terms imprecisely, in other words, not in a Kantian sense, which would be the usual way of thinking of this term. Is I'm going to make a distinction between analysis and critique. And I want to say that the action of rendering concepts visible is the action of analyzing them and making them questionable. That is something distinct from the action of critique, which is saying that's a shitty way of doing it, that's a good way of doing it. Right? I mean, again, I'm using critique very, very loosely there. In other words, simply because we've said here are the constellation of concepts that enable a syllabus doesn't mean that we should change anything. Right? Here are the constellation of concepts that enable an ethos, pathos, logos reading of a letter from Birmingham jail doesn't mean we should look at a reception history or People magazine. It doesn't in and of itself mean anything. And this is tricky because I think a lot of people think it does. By rendering the concepts visible, you have already made them somehow less strong. You have already critiqued them. You've already said there's something problematic about them, just in saying, here are the constellation of concepts. And so I think one of the things that has caused the antagonism, part of the antagonism in the reception of theory in humanities departments is this sort of indistinction between analysis and critique. By both theorists and anti-theorists. I mean, I don't think that like everybody's doing this. That you think that, well, just because we've demonstrated that patriarchy is a historical structure doesn't mean it should or can go away. Right? That's another step to say, oh, and by the way, that patriarchy thing is bad for people. You know? So the simple demonstration of it is itself simply rendering concepts visible. I'm pretending that it's value neutral, but just for current purposes. Does that make sense? Is all this making total sense? Does it seem like kind of frighteningly? All right. I want to talk about resistances to theory. There's a lot of these. The first and one that I alluded to in terms of the inefficiency argument is that theory gets in the way of practice. I mean, think about it. If, by definition, what theory is the rendering visible of concepts that you otherwise don't pay any attention to, it is, by definition, interruptive of practice, right? Whatever one is referring to as practice in that instance. You're interrupting. You're making it less easy to do it. So this is not wrong. that theory, in this sense, calling attention to the constitutive elements of a particular practice interrupts it, gets in its way. You know, when you go into Starbucks, you don't want to think about your immersion in consumerism, global capitalism, agricultural destruction, labor issues that you are participating in with your vanilla latte. You are, right? I mean, you are. You don't want to pay attention. You don't want to think about that because you want your damn vanilla latte, you know? And thinking about that would make it a little bit harder. But the problem is you can't go anywhere and get a vanilla latte that doesn't involve those things. So sorry, if you're going to like vanilla lattes, you're stuck. Is there such a thing as a vanilla latte? I just said those
No,
words.
right here.
Excellent. You are the problem.
It's not theoretical, it's practical.
So, I mean, there's that sense in which theory irritates people because it could force them to attend to things that they don't want to pay attention to because they're uncomfortable for any number of reasons. Or, not just that they're uncomfortable, but it just stops you from the ease with which you can do things non-theoretically. And let me say, like, I'm sympathetic to this to a certain perspective, to a certain extent. And the sense is this, which is you can't pay attention to everything all the time. You have to be selective about the things that you are going to attend to. So if I'm saying all actions are, all practices are constructed by concepts, you would never move, right? You would simply be immersed in this constant theorizing of all of the concepts and then theorizing on the theorizing of the concepts and that sort of fun loop. And so there is a sense in which, so for instance, I refer to here the common usage of words. Now I'm using the word common in a very common way there, right? But there are very precise usages of the word common in terms of common sense that is a much more, so I'm electing to be inattentive in order to be attentive to something else. That's what you're always doing. That's the game. That's what it means to live, is to ignore a whole bunch of stuff to focus on particular kinds of things. So when I say I'm sympathetic to this theory gets in the way of practice, is that, yeah, you have to select, right? That's true. You're always, I would say that you're always making these political choices, but not as choices. It's not like you go, which things will I think about? That you are, by living, politically choosing which things are worth attending to and which things aren't. So therefore, it's a strategic question of selective attention. I mean, on the other hand, I'm not at all sympathetic to the idea, the flip side of that, which is, the desire to ignore the fact that going to Starbucks means you're immersing yourself in all of these things. I mean, just not wanting to recognize that that's the case. I'm not sympathetic to that position, and this is I want to be able to do what I want to do and not have to think about its implications or its effects in any way. This is, to me, this is the Forrest Gumpification of the world. It's like, if you don't pay too much of attention and you don't really, think too much about stuff, everything will be just fine. I think that's a really dangerous lesson, and it's this is the Bush administration lesson. Don't pay attention, don't think too much, we'll take care of things for you, And that's Forrest Gump, to me, is the movie of the Bush administration. Everything will be just fine as long as you go about your world as an idiot. In the movie, anyone who's politically active or attentive in any way gets AIDS, loses their legs, anybody who's involved in the world dies or horrified, whereas this guy who's just everything goes great for him, I don't think I can be friends with people who love the movie Forrest Gump, but that's okay. Okay, the second sense, that's theory getting in the way of practice. The second sense is that theory doesn't immediately help my practice. This theory doesn't immediately and obviously tell me what to do. This is a version of theory as method. Theory is supposed to, so for instance, you get this, Foucault's notion of authorship is very interesting, but it doesn't tell me what to do with my freshman writing class, or the Frankfurt School's version of culture might be interesting, but what does that mean for my business writing class, right? It doesn't tell me what to do. So this critique always sounds to me like, it's like saying, the problem with the show House of Cards is that it doesn't tell me how to negotiate my relationship with my parents. Well, that is at least in part because the show House of Cards isn't about you and your parents, right? In part, right? Now, it's also the case that you could learn things about yourself and your relationship to your parents by watching the House of Cards, which, by the way, you should all do. Have you seen House of Cards? Game of Thrones, this is just going to be the Jaren. It's Game of Thrones or House of Cards. It's pretty much 6 of 1. But you could, right? Like you could, by attending to this TV show in particular way, learn something about ways of interacting with one's parents or whatever. And the same is true. Like you could learn something about how to think about your teaching of writing from Foucault's authorship. It's just up to you to do it. Foucault didn't do it, right? And nor is he necessarily expected to. Or you could learn about how to teach business writing differently by studying the Frankfurt School. And by the way, you get an instant publication from that because nobody's doing it. I mean, which is amazing, right? Business writing, nobody's really doing. We're going to be offering a grad class in business writing in the spring, so I'm plugging that in advance. I will not be teaching it, so it's going to be really good. And let me say, I think the question, well, what can I do with this, is a really great question to ask in relation to theory, in the sense of, if it's at the beginning of an inquiry, what can I do with this essay by Derrida? Right? How can it inform something? That's a great question to ask. How can I connect it to something else and make it do something? I think it's a terrible question to ask if it's at the end of inquiry in the process of giving up, which is, what can I do with this, right? So it's a perfectly good question when asked in one tone, and not a very good question, or it shuts down inquiry. But also keep in mind that if the purpose of theory is to render visible a constellation of concepts, one of the things that that requires a certain amount of patience is that what these works can do, what engaging them in a certain light can do, is problematize the way you do things, whatever those things may be. In other words, it can make you, the danger here is of what can I do with this becomes, how can I take Adorno's theory to simply do basically the same old thing that I was doing, and just add some Adorno spice into it. This is the usual, this is in literary studies, this is an incredibly commonplace. This is the undergraduate version of theory, which is, let's do a Marxist reading of this, let's do a structuralist reading of this, let's do without any question about whether or not Marxism would problematize the very notion of doing a reading. Or the version that I've frequently heard is, in 2 different comprehensive exams, or no, they were dissertation defenses, I believe, which is, how does Don DeLillo, I don't remember if it was DeLillo, some author, how does Don DeLillo's work problematize the question of the death, or play out the question of the death of the author? This is asked by faculty members, which strikes me, on one hand, again, this is the sort of, there's a self-evidence which I understand what that question is after, but there's another level on which I'm like, you're talking about the death of the author by attributing it to an author. The first part of that, so how does great author X problematize the function of authorship? It's like, well, you've already answered, So again, while I understand the question and what it's after, but it's an instance where Barthes's critique of authorship and Foucault's critique of authorship could push one to ask different kinds of questions. In other words, questions that don't begin with great authors. They don't have to, but they could. And that's what I say. So there's a certain danger in the what can I do with this simply being a plug-and-play mode of I'll take this idea from Marxism and go about my business. I want to try to encourage you, and it's up to you, right? It's the extent to which you can allow it to re-articulate or mutate the kind of things that you do in your scholarship and in your teaching. In an interview with Foucault, Deleuze calls theories as a toolbox. And I think this is useful because a toolbox doesn't tell you how to build a house, or how to build anything for that matter. Right? It just gives you a bunch of implements with which to experiment, or to try things out and see how they fit together. Some of which do some things better than others. That hammer doesn't cut very well. Right? So that's a potentially useful way of thinking of theory. Another resistance is that theory is jargon-filled and poorly written. I have to say, I always find this to be a strange critique because it issues from people who read T.S. Eliot and what is, I think, generally the most difficult language in the English-speaking world, and they complain about Derrida. I find that shocking. Modernist poetry is not easy to read. And now, this is in literary studies particularly, right? This sort of literary version of that. Now, keep in mind that resistance, or the distinction that's made between Derrida and T.S. Eliot, is, it's itself predicated on a theory, which is a theory that sees aesthetics and rational discourse as different kinds of things, mind, body, right? Body at the level of practice or aesthetics is less concerned with making clear, reasonable sense, but that's what this discourse is supposed to be. And when theorists chunk them together, it becomes difficult. In rhetorical studies, the distinction is different. We don't have the aesthetic versus rational discourse thing. But we very much have the theory versus practice thing. I mean, it's still very much alive and well. And so you still will get this resistance. The theory is supposed to be the clearer, explanatory discourse in relationship to practice. Practice is murky, right, and complex. Theory is the thing that clarifies. Look, I would say, rather than being jargon-filled or poorly written, you could realize that these texts come out of traditions with which you're not yet familiar. I mean, you wouldn't pick up a contemporary chemistry journal and say it was poorly written. You would say, I don't understand it, because I don't know the discourse, right? And that's true here as well. So, I mean, to me, it's unsurprising that you can pick up, you pick up Lacan and find him difficult to read. Because you haven't spent much time reading Lacan. So that's not that surprising. Lacan is writing in an intellectual milieu. It's not that Lacan is I'm not claiming that he's any kind of great writer. He's just responding to a series of problematics that by definition you don't yet know, right? And the more you learn about those problematics, those institutional histories, those conceptual histories, the precise usage and the lineages, the easier it'll be for you to read Lacan. And then you'll be like, well, this is a little bit too simple. Kind of see Jane on. I was trying to avoid saying dick there. That's how my instinct was. Let me talk briefly, because you guys are in English departments. The relationship between theory and graduate study is a particularly interesting one, insofar as most places there's a real divide between kind of undergraduate education and graduate education when it comes to theory. That undergraduate education is all about exposing one to certain types of texts. And then graduate education is all about learning how to think in relationship to those texts. So graduate education, you have this incredible divide, which is all of the people that go to graduate school go thinking that they're going to do some advanced version of what they were doing in undergrad, and they get there and they realize, wow, this is just completely different than what I was expecting. Because theory, there's a sense in which, for practical purposes, if you want to get a job today, you have to be theoretically sophisticated. In English departments in general. You have to have some sense of what feminisms are, some sense of what post-coloniality is. So you have to have that. And you have to have, when you do a project, you have to have, that's a general sense, you have to have a very particular developed angle for your own area of study. In other words, it's no longer a question about simply reading books. You have to actually have something to say about those books that's not simply your idiosyncratic, it makes me feel fuzzy. you know. So there is, that's another sort of troubled relation. Is like you're training this whole group of people to come into this thing that's completely different than what they thought. Now, that problem is exacerbated in the case of rhetoric because we don't really even exist at the undergraduate level, right? There is this very strange way in which institutionally, rhetoric exists for freshmen in writing classes, and that's basically as ethos, pathos, logos, audience. That's it. And then graduate education to train people to teach those, or to run the courses that teach those freshmen. So that's even a stranger split. There isn't like an undergraduate curriculum in rhetoric at all. There's some exceptions. I mean, there are classes here and there, but there's certainly nothing established. So yeah, I mean, that issue is exacerbated, the sort of disconnect of what does it mean to do graduate study in rhetoric or in theory. Both of them, like in rhetorical theory, is then doubly that, right? Okay, brief introduction to theory. English, now I'm going to start introducing it. And this is more of an institutional history. I mean, when one teaches a class on theory, I've really struggled all semester with how to teach this class, or all summer, with what to put on the syllabus. I mean, what to read. And I've chosen what I've chosen for a number of different reasons. But not the least of which is that I already teach a literary and cultural theory graduate class that I'll be doing next spring, and I don't want to teach the same stuff. But I could. I mean, I could just do a sort of slightly rhetoricized, wrong distinction between what goes under the name of critical theory and what goes under the name of rhetorical theory. So this syllabus could be filled with Foucault and Derrida and Austin and some Burke sprinkled in, and I mean that's an entirely imaginable way of constructing such a course. And very simply, the reason that I didn't do that is because I'll do that in the spring. So if you want this sort of generalized survey of 1968 to like 2000, that's there. It would probably be helpful for most of you. In other words, to take that before taking this. I mean, you're already screwed. You're in this class, so sorry. One could easily teach this class in a kind of Plato-Tenedo sense, which is, I mean, what rhetorical theory, you would start with the sophists, you would read Plato, you would read Aristotle, you would read Longinus on the Sublime, maybe some Cicero, probably Quintilian, Erasmus. So you're right, like you could do that. Basically the Basel-Herzberg collection of the rhetorical tradition. The reason I don't do that is because we have a classical rhetoric class. I mean, so we have, I mean, really the reasons for not doing the class the usual way is institutional. I mean, it's primarily institutional. We have a theory class and we have a classical rhetoric class. And so therefore, this modern, I mean, we're unusual in having a three-part historical sequence. Most classes in rhetorical theory will start with Plato, with the sophists, and they will go over 2,000 years and they will end with Kenneth Burke. We start with Kenneth Burke. So that's a difference. I also think there are problems with that historical story of theory in lots of ways because, for instance, well, we don't need to talk about that. I think the historical version presents one with an artificial idea that something that was an idea 200 years ago is somehow past now, but it's not at all. So we're now in the realm of post-process pedagogy, for instance. But 95% of teachers of writing are process teachers. And if you teach that as process post-process, you will give the wrong impression. So I'm sketchy on the historical. The other way to think of theory, and this is one totally reasonable understanding of it, is rather than think of teaching this class or introducing theories, rather than that massive historical sweep, is that you begin with what are considered the three late 19th century, early 20th century most important thinkers, Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche, and the intellectual lineages which they generated. You can make a map of this, actually. You can put like Lacan on Freud, we could put Derrida on Nietzsche, we could put Althusser on Marx, and we could situate people sort of, Foucault sort of in between Marx and Nietzsche. I mean, we could really come up with a diagram of that, of all of those folks. And that's a perfectly reasonable way of teaching the class. And that is, in some level, more how I teach the class in the spring. So we're not doing it that way either. So I raise these ways. But it's useful to know heuristics for introducing things. Allegedly. In English departments, the story goes something like this. 40 years ago, there was this vague consensus about what people did in English departments, and it was that they worked on literature in some capacity, some way, shape, or form. That vague consensus began to break down around a certain time when people began posing questions, very specifically canonical questions. Why this and not that? Right? Why not Toni Morrison? And these questions then forced, within literary studies, the questions then that emerge are like, well, what is literature? What does it mean to read? This is the emergence of theory in roughly 30 to 40 years ago in English departments. And let me also say, it was both a theoretical in the sense of abstract question, but it was also a practical one, which is like, what courses do we offer? We have an English major. What courses should you have to take? That's not a theoretical question, right? It is premised, as all practices are, on theories, but it's a quite practical question. What should people have to take to get an English major? And so, again, so the story goes is that there was this vague consensus, but that vague consensus began to break down within English departments around these questions of what counted as literature, what it meant to value, whether or not one should even think about what it means to value literature. And don't underestimate the sort of importation of foreign. A lot of theory is foreign from France, a lot of it. Don't underestimate the impact of that. There's an impact. You have then, in the 70s and 80s, the emergence of all these different strains of theoretical, deconstructive criticism, psychoanalytic criticism, reader-response criticism, phenomenology of reading. You have all of these different so you have this kind of height of theory moment where all of these different operations were going on. And in rhetorical studies, the same is true on a much smaller scale. So yeah, you have people who were doing psychoanalytic readings of things. People who are doing reader-response reading, reception history, Steve Mayhew, which we're going to look at, this reception history approach, which is based on phenomenology of reading theory. Which merges into, in literary studies, these series of questions about authorship, textuality, reading, etc., transforms into more cultural questions. Race, gender, sexuality. You have a movement over those 40 years, and this is too easy of an arc, but this is sort of a tendency. You have a movement from what we could recognizably call literary theory, because it's about authorship or something, to what we could loosely call cultural theory, because it's about larger questions of sociality and gender and things that you wouldn't immediately think of 50 years ago as being relevant to the study of literature. And that's precisely the point, is changing the constitution of the field. So that's a sense in which, and theory today is this much more social theory. That's why I say there's not a huge distinction between what I would call rhetorical theory and what I would call critical theory. So I could very easily teach the class around, we're just an introduction to critical theory. And truthfully, the only reason I'm not is because I don't want to teach the same thing. Would you prefer if I teach the same thing? And now you have a situation, I think, where it's like English departments, rather than operating on this vague consensus model, I think they're much more like large corporations with they have different wings of their businesses that do really different things. You've got film studies, you've got comparative literature, you certainly have literary studies, you have rhetoric and composition, you have linguistics, and it's different everywhere. You've got all of these different folks who are doing wildly different things on wildly different types of texts, or sometimes not texts at all. And so you have less of this understanding of we're all sort of in it together, and more of we're just this loose constellation of different types of things. Like GE doesn't just make light bulbs anymore, right? They've diversified their portfolio, as have the English departments. The story, of course, would be from someone like comparative literature, is this theory came in via comparative literature and then English colonized it. And now comparative literature is disappearing as a result and English is ballooning. That wouldn't simply be wrong. Okay, I want to turn briefly, I said that before, didn't I? To specifically rhetorical theory.